The Filipino sun was hidden behind grey clouds that Thursday morning, as if the sky itself shared the grief that hung over the small cemetery on the outskirts of Manila. Manny Pacquiao gazed through his car window as his driver navigated the easy, busy streets of the capital. In his hands, a small newspaper clipping trembled slightly. The news about the premature death of Ernesto, the 19-year-old son of Ramon Dalisay, his former rival in the ring. The memory of exchanging blows with Ramon more than a decade ago was still vivid in his mind, as were the harsh words they had traded during the preparation for their fights. The vehicle finally stopped in front of the cemetery, where dozens of people dressed in black were already gathering, many looking with surprise when they recognized the famous boxer stepping out of the car. Manny adjusted the black tie over his impeccable white shirt, feeling a lump in his throat as he imagined the pain his former rival must be feeling at that moment. He himself had children and couldn't imagine the devastation of losing one of them to a disease as cruel as the leukemia that had taken young Ernesto after 2 years of fighting. Pacquiao walked slowly among the tombstones, carrying a small arrangement of white flowers that he had personally chosen that morning. He knew his presence might cause a stir, after all. The rivalry between him and Ramon had been intense and widely publicized by the Filipino media. After their last fight, when Manny won by unanimous decision, they had never spoken again, and rumors of deep resentment from Ramon had always circulated in the country's sporting circles. In the distance, Manny spotted Ramon's hunched silhouette, now with grey hair and shoulders slumped by the weight of sadness, beside his wife Jocelyn, who seemed about to collapse at any moment. Around them, family members formed a protective circle, while the white casket decorated with flowers waited to be lowered into the ground. Manny hesitated for a moment, questioning whether his presence might be interpreted as an intrusion into such an intimate moment of family grief. With firm yet respectful steps, he decided to move forward, ignoring the surprised looks and whispers that his arrival provoked. He wasn't there as Manny Pacquiao, the famous boxer, senator, and national celebrity, but simply as a father who understood the value of life and the irreparable meaning of losing a child. In his pocket, something weighed more than the flowers in his hands, an envelope that carried not only a gesture of condolence, but a promise he hoped to fulfill. Ramon Dalisay didn't immediately notice Pacquiao's presence among the mourners, focused on consoling his wife, who was silently sobbing by his side. Only when the priest paused in his prayer and a murmur ran through the small crowd did Ramon raise his eyes and find the familiar face of his former rival just a few meters away. His body instantly stiffened, a complex mixture of emotions crossing, his exhausted gaze, surprise, confusion, and a shadow of the old resentment he had nurtured for so many years. Time had been generous to Manny, thought Ramon, observing the man who had once taken away his world title, and along with it the chance for financial stability for his family. After the defeat, Ramon never managed to recover his boxing career, having to work as a trainer in local gyms to support his wife and 3 children. Ernesto, the eldest, had been his pride and hope, a brilliant medical student who dreamed of becoming an oncologist, a dream now buried along with his young body consumed by disease. Jocelyn, sensing the tension in her husband's body, followed his gaze and also noticed Pacquiao. Her face, marked by sleepless nights at the hospital bedside, showed a different emotion than Ramon's, mild surprise followed by a certain relief. She had always told her husband that the rivalry with Manny was a thing of the past, that harboring resentments only poisoned them from within, especially after Ernesto fell ill and they had to sell almost everything to pay for medical treatments, not covered by the precarious healthcare system. The funeral service continued with the priest resuming his prayers, while family and friends of Ernesto shared memories of the young student who had touched so many lives in his brief 19 years. Among stories of his kindness, determination, and interrupted dreams, many mentioned how he always spoke with admiration about Manny Pacquiao, ironically considering him an example of perseverance, despite knowing about the old rivalry with his father. Ernesto had even written a school paper on Pacquiao's journey, analyzing how his discipline could be applied to medical studies. As the casket began to be lowered, Ramon felt the weight of his loss become even more real. Silent tears streamed down his wrinkled face, and not even the unexpected presence of his former rival seemed important now. All that mattered was the emptiness that would remain in his life, the silence that would occupy the place of Ernesto's, laughter throughout the house, the shattered dreams of seeing his son in a white coat saving lives, as he himself had never managed to do. After the ceremony ended, people began to slowly disperse, casting curious glances at Manny Pacquiao, who remained respectfully at a distance, still holding the white flowers. He observed from afar as friends and family embraced Ramon and Jocelyn, offering words of consolation that seemed to get lost in the grief-laden air. The couple's two younger children, 16-year-old Ligaya and 14-year-old Paolo, stayed close to their parents, their eyes red from crying for the loss of their older brother, who had always been their protector and inspiration. Manny hesitated, considering whether he should simply leave the flowers and depart without approaching the family. After all, his presence might reopen old wounds at an already painful moment. However, something in Ramon's lost gaze, in the defeated posture of a man who had once been a fierce competitor in the ring, compelled him to move forward. With measured steps and the envelope weighing in his pocket, he finally gathered courage and walked toward the grieving family, feeling the eyes of those present following his every movement. Young Ligaya was the first to notice him approaching. Her eyes widened in recognition, having grown up seeing posters and news stories about the famous boxer, even though her father rarely mentioned Pacquiao's name at home. She nudged her brother Paolo, who also looked with a mixture of surprise and youthful admiration, momentarily distracted from his pain by the presence of the national legend. The teenager's reaction alerted Jocelyn, who lightly touched her husband's arm, preparing him for the encounter that was about to happen after more than a decade of distance. When they finally stood face to face, Manny and Ramon studied each other in silence for a long moment. Time had changed both men, gray hair, wrinkles around the eyes, hands calloused by different battles of life. They were no longer the young fighters thirsty for glory and recognition, but mature men who had faced victories and defeats far beyond the rings. Manny was the first to break the silence, extending his hand in a gesture that carried respect and sincere condolences, his eyes conveying a deep understanding of the pain that only a father could comprehend. To the surprise of all present, Ramon did not hesitate to accept the gesture, firmly shaking the hand of his former rival as silent tears began to stream down his face, marked by suffering. In that simple touch, years of resentment seemed to dissipate like mist under the morning sun, replaced by the perception that, in the face of death, old rivalries completely lost their meaning. Jocelyn, observing the encounter with teary eyes, felt a wave of relief course through her exhausted body, as if an invisible weight was momentarily lifted from her family's shoulders. After the brief greeting, Manny offered the white flowers to Jocelyn, who accepted them with a sad smile, noticing they were butterfly orchids, Ernesto's favorites. This small detail, the fact that Pacquiao knew such a personal preference of her son, immediately sparked Jocelyn's curiosity. How could he know something so specific about Ernesto? She watched attentively as Manny turned to the two younger children, offering words of comfort with a gentleness she would never have expected from the man her husband had described for years as arrogant and ruthless. Manny then removed the envelope he was carrying from his pocket and with a respectful gesture extended it to Ramon. He explained in a low and humble voice that he had followed Ernesto's fight against leukemia through social media and fundraising campaigns that friends of the young man had organized in recent months. He confessed that he had tried several times to reach out to offer help, but had always backed down at the last moment, fearing that his gesture would be interpreted as charity or worse, as a form of public display of generosity. Ramon accepted the envelope with trembling hands, confused about what it might contain. Upon opening it, his eyes quickly scanned the contents. It wasn't money as he might have expected, but official documents establishing a foundation in Ernesto Dalisay's name. A foundation dedicated to helping young Filipinos diagnosed with leukemia, offering quality medical treatment and financial support for families without resources. The official name of the organization would be Ernesto Dalisay Foundation for Young Warriors, a reference to the bravery with which the young man had faced his disease until the end. Jocelyn, reading over her husband's shoulder, brought her hands to her mouth, unable to contain a sob. The two younger children approached, curious to understand what had provoked such a reaction in their already emotionally exhausted parents. Manny explained, with simplicity and without any trace of pride, that the foundation was already legally established and with initial funds sufficient to immediately help at least 50 families in a similar situation to what they had faced. But most importantly, he emphasized, the foundation would be administered by the Dalisay family, with Ramon and Jocelyn as main directors if they so wished. The gentle wind rustled the leaves of the cemetery trees as Ramon tried to process what was happening. In his hands he held not just documents, but the possibility of transforming the tragedy of losing his son into hope for other families. For a moment, he saw Ernesto in his mind again, not consumed by disease in his final days, but vibrant and full of dreams, talking about how he wanted to become a doctor to help people who couldn't afford expensive treatments. In some mysterious way, his son's dream could now be realized, even if he was no longer physically present to witness it. The silence that followed was broken by Paolo, the youngest son, who, with the innocence of his 14 years, asked Manny why he had decided to do something so significant for a family he hadn't been in contact with for years. The question hung in the air, causing all eyes to turn to Pacquiao, waiting for an answer that could explain such unexpected generosity. Manny took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Ernesto's newly placed tombstone, before sharing a story he had never told publicly. With a voice choked with emotion, Manny revealed that about a year ago, during an autograph session at a children's hospital in Manila, he had met a young patient who identified himself only as Nesto. The young man, wearing a mask and a cap that covered his hairless head due to chemotherapy, had briefly conversed with him, impressing him with his knowledge of boxing and his positive attitude despite the disease. At the end of the encounter, the young man handed Manny a sealed letter, asking that he only open it when he got home. That same night, alone in his office, Manny opened the letter and discovered that Nesto was actually Ernesto Dalisay, son of his former rival. The letter, written with the eloquence of someone far beyond his years, contained no resentments or requests, just a story. Ernesto related how, despite the rivalry between his father and Pacquiao, he had always secretly admired him, studying his discipline, perseverance, and especially his philanthropic actions. The young man confessed that he had been inspired by Manny's journey to pursue medicine, dreaming of one day being able to help people from poor communities, just as Pacquiao did through his donations and social projects. As Manny recounted the contents of the letter, Jocelyn began to cry silently, recognizing in the described words the unmistakable voice of her firstborn. Ramon remained motionless, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, surprise at discovering that his son had secretly admired his greatest rival, and a pang of paternal jealousy mixed with a growing feeling of gratitude. Ligaya and Paolo listened, attentively, discovering a side of their brother that he had never fully shared with them. Manny continued, explaining that at the end of the letter, Ernesto had made a single request, that if something happened to him, Pacquiao would consider helping his father overcome not only the loss, but also the resentment that had consumed him for years. The young man believed that his father, a fundamentally good man, had allowed the bitterness of defeat to poison parts of his life, preventing him from achieving the peace he deserved. Ernesto ended the letter not with self-pity in the face of the possibility of death, but with hope that something positive could emerge even from the most painful circumstances, a legacy of reconciliation and renewed purpose. A gentle breeze swept through the cemetery, softly swaying the flowers on the freshly covered grave as the group remained silent, absorbing the revelation. Ramon finally turned his gaze from the documents in his hands to face Manny, seeing him in a new light. No longer as the rival who had destroyed his chances of glory in the past, but as the man whom his own son had chosen as the bearer of a message of hope. The tears that now flowed freely down Ramon's face were not only from the pain of loss, but from a complex mixture of regret for time wasted on resentments and gratitude for the unexpected opportunity to honor Ernesto's memory. Jocelyn, always the most pragmatic one in the family, was the first to break the silence, asking Manny practical details about how the foundation would work. With a firm voice despite the tears, she wanted to understand how they could transform this idea into a functional reality that would truly help other families avoid going through the same financial and emotional difficulties they faced during Ernesto's treatment. Her mind was already working on the possibilities, on the lives they could save, on the fathers and mothers they could console with the experience gained in their own journey of pain. Manny explained that he had assembled a team of professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, and social workers, all ready to start working as soon as the family was ready. The foundation's headquarters was already rented, a modest but functional space near Manila's main children's oncology hospital. The initial funds would guarantee operations for at least 2 years, enough time to establish partnerships with companies and international organizations that could make the project sustainable in the long term. Everything was prepared, waiting only for the Dalisay family to take their place at the helm of the initiative when they felt ready. Ligaya, who had remained quiet until then, stepped forward with surprising confidence for her 16 years. With a voice choked but determined, she shared how Ernesto always talked about creating something that could help other people when he finished medical school. In recent months, when it became clear that he might not survive, he had talked several times with her about his desire to leave a positive legacy in the world. Ligaya looked directly at Manny, thanking him for finding a way to transform her brother's dream into reality, even when everything seemed lost. Paolo, the most reserved of the Dalisay children, finally found the courage to speak, revealing something he had kept secret until that moment. In the last months of Ernesto's life, while accompanying him to chemotherapy sessions, he had begun studying medical informatics, fascinated by the possibility of creating systems that could help in the early diagnosis of diseases like leukemia. With a shy but determined voice, the teenager expressed his desire to contribute to the foundation by developing an app that could connect patients to medical resources and psychological support, creating a virtual community for families facing similar situations across the country. The clouds were beginning to disperse in the Manila sky, allowing some rays of sunlight to illuminate the small group gathered around Ernesto's grave. Ramon, still holding the foundation documents, took a few steps toward his son's tombstone, gently touching the cold marble as if seeking a final connection before making his decision. For a long moment he remained there in silence, a mute conversation happening between father and son that transcended the barrier between life and death. When he finally turned around, his eyes had changed. The weight of bitterness he had carried for years seemed to have been replaced by a renewed determination. With a firm voice, Ramon addressed Manny, extending his hand not just in a gesture of acceptance of the foundation proposal, but as a symbol of complete reconciliation. The words that followed surprised all those present. Ramon asked forgiveness for having harbored resentments for so long, acknowledging how this feeling had harmed not only himself, but also his family. He admitted that his wounded pride after the defeat in the ring had transformed into an emotional prison from which he couldn't escape, even when it meant refusing help that could have benefited Ernesto's treatment in its early stages. Manny accepted the gesture with humility, confessing that he too carried regrets. He revealed that after his victory over Ramon, he had tried several times to establish contact, offering partnerships in boxing gyms and work opportunities, but always through intermediaries, never having the courage to personally face the man who, according to rumors, deeply hated him. Pacquiao admitted that perhaps, if he had insisted more, if he had shown more courage outside the rings, both their lives could have followed different, possibly more positive paths. As the two former rivals finally spoke openly, Jocelyn, Ligaya, and Paolo observed with a mixture of relief and hope. The matriarch of the Dalisay family, who had witnessed for years the silent suffering of her husband, trapped in memories of lost glory, now perceived how Ernesto's death, as painful as it was catalyzing a long-needed healing. Ligaya, with wisdom beyond her years, reflected on how her brother, even physically absent, continued to unite people and inspire positive changes, exactly as he had done in life. The sun was now shining completely, bathing the cemetery in a golden light that seemed almost symbolic. Manny, feeling it was time to leave the family to process everything that had happened, began to say goodbye, promising to get in touch in the coming days to discuss the next steps for the foundation. Before he could walk away, however, he was surprised by an unexpected gesture. Ramon invited him to dinner at his house that night, a simple but deeply meaningful invitation that symbolized the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between the two families. That same evening, the modest Dalisay house on the outskirts of Manila was illuminated, and for the first time in many months, sounds of animated conversations replaced the oppressive silence that had dominated the environment since Ernesto's illness worsened. In the small dining room, decorated with family photos and some boxing trophies from Ramon's glory days, Manny Pacquiao was seated at the table together with the family who, hours earlier, had buried their firstborn. The contrast between the pain of loss and the hope born from that meeting created a unique atmosphere, permeated by an almost tangible feeling that Ernesto, somehow, was present among them. Jocelyn had prepared a simple but affectionate meal, using the few resources that still remained after the astronomical expenses with her son's treatment. As they served the food, Paulo surprised everyone by asking to show something on his laptop. He had spent the few hours since the funeral working on an initial prototype of the app he had mentioned at the cemetery. With youthful pride mixed with impressive determination, he showed the initial screens of what he had called Project Ernesto, a system that would connect patients, doctors, and donors, facilitating both access to treatments and fundraising. For specific cases, Ligaya, inspired by her younger brother's initiative, shared her own desire to contribute to the foundation. With eyes shining with enthusiasm despite the emotional exhaustion, she revealed that she intended to use her talent for writing, something she had inherited from Ernesto, to document stories of young patients and their families, creating a platform where they could share experiences, fears, and hopes. Her project, she explained timidly, would be a way to ensure that no one felt alone during the treatment process, as they had often felt during the most difficult moments of Ernesto's journey. Ramon, observing his two younger children with a mixture of pride and amazement, realized how the tragedy had accelerated their maturation, transforming them into young people determined to make a difference in the world. Turning to Manny, he shared his own vision for the foundation, using his experience as a boxing trainer to create a program of adapted physical activities for young people recovering from cancer treatments, helping them rebuild strength and confidence in their bodies that had been so mistreated by the disease. In his mind, he already visualized a space where children and adolescents could feel powerful and capable again, away from the hospital environment that often made them feel fragile and dependent. As the night progressed and plans for the foundation took shape amid shared dishes and memories of Ernesto gently interwoven in the conversation, a silent transformation was occurring in that simple house. The pain of loss had not disappeared and would never completely disappear, but alongside it grew something equally powerful, a sense of renewed purpose, a collective mission that would honor the memory of the young man they had lost while potentially saving other families from experiencing the same pain. And at the center of this transformation was Manny Pacquiao's unexpected gesture, the former rival who had become a catalyst for healing and hope in the darkest moment of the Dalisay family. In Ernesto's empty room, where his medical books were still organized on the shelf and his white intern's coat hung on the door like an interrupted dream, a photograph on the study desk captured a moment that no one in the house knew about. Ernesto next to Manny Pacquiao in the hospital, both smiling, the young man in cap and mask handing a letter to the boxer. Below the photo, written in the firm handwriting of the medical student, a simple phrase that now seemed almost prophetic. Sometimes we need to lose, a fight to inspire a greater victory. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to our channel.